said, well, they can't go, but there's no provision to keep them in, so there's nothing I can do
You
about
mean
it.
they were seceding?
So they were all leaving. So that apparently then when Lincoln finally got to the White House, Mr. Buchanan greeted him saying, I hope that you are as happy to get this job as I am happy to be leaving this job. But that was 1860. I don't think we'll have anything exactly like that this year, but things have changed considerably.
Well, locking everybody out was something, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
We're talking with DoughHouck. Doug is a prolific author, educator par excellence, was third guy in charge of Hawaii, the state of Hawaii's educational system. He currently teaches at the university level at more than one university, as I recall.
Yeah, I teach at Edison State College and Barry University, 2 schools.
Right. I
teach primarily English and writing classes.
He's a local resident in the summer. He lives in Westfield, New York, and he lives the rest of the year in Florida. And you, at this point, you just finished a book now. What was this book about?
Okay, this is the one.
He writes about history, which is fascinating.
Yeah. I'm involved with the Florida Writers Association, which is about 1,400 people in the state of Florida. And this is the book that I actually just finished down there. It's called the Peace River Boundary. And the Peace River is the river that comes due from central Florida, comes through into Charlotte Harbor, Punta Gorda. And the Peace River became the river as a result of the Second Seminole War, in a way, so to speak. During the Second Seminole War, which was a war that was started after Andrew Jackson, we were talking about Andrew Jackson earlier, Andrew Jackson decided to remove all of the Indians, Native Americans who lived east of the Mississippi, going to move them west of the Mississippi. That was what Andrew Jackson decided to do. And he moved out the Cherokee and moved out many other Native American tribes, communities. But when he came to the Seminole in Florida, the Seminole, they decided they weren't going.
No deal, they said.
They weren't going. They weren't going to Oklahoma or wherever they wanted them to go. And they decided to stay. And the actual second Seminole War began in the early 1830s and continued through until 1839. And by the time that Martin Van Buren was president, he faced the situation of where the Second Seminole War was taking up 10% of the entire federal budget. Now, the federal budget, the federal government in those days, was only funded by a couple of sources of revenue. They had the tariff, the tax on imports. That was the one source of funding. And the other source of funding was the whiskey tax. And those were the only 2 taxes the federal government had. But when this war was taking up 10% of the income, Martin Van Buren did not want to go to the House of Representatives to try to get them to float a bond to cover this, because he knew that they simply wouldn't do it. So he sent General Alexander Macomb to Florida to end the war. And he was told, Macomb was simply told to go to Florida, do what you have to do, but end the Second Seminole War. And at the time, nobody knew exactly how to do this, and Macomb put a party together. Took him about 2 weeks to get to Florida, and General Macomb himself was an interesting fellow. In this book, I talk about how Macomb was involved during the War of 1812, and during the War of 1812, he got involved with the disaster at Chrysler's Farm, which is up on the St. Lawrence River, where General Wilkinson was trying to go down the St. Lawrence. He had about 6,000 people traveling down the St. Lawrence to try to seize the city of Montreal. But then they stop along where Ogdensburg is, and some of the Canadian snipers on the other side of the river were taking a few shots at Wilkinson, so he sent some people over to get rid of the snipers. And he sent over a Brigadier General Macomb, and Brigadier General Macomb took a couple thousand people over. He figured he was just facing Canadian militia, so he could chase those guys away. So he started chasing them back, and the English-British forces backed away from the river, waiting until the American forces came ashore, and then they held a position and they counterattacked with regular British forces. And General Macomb had a lot of casualties there at Chrysler's Farm. Now, the United States, we don't talk too much about Chrysler's Farm, but they do in Canada.
I never heard of it.
Canada, they do, okay. See, we have a different attitude toward the War of 1812 than Canada does, because we are now in the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812, and the Canadian government asked the United States government to join them to commemorate the war. And the United States government says, thanks, but no thanks. We're not participating in that. But at any rate, Macomb got defeated at Chrysler's Farm, lost a lot of his troops. General Wilkinson wanted to get rid of him, so he sent him off to Plattsburgh. When he got to Plattsburgh, the English then decided to come down through the launch, and Canadians come down through and launch an invasion to seize Plattsburgh, and he just kept backing up, avoiding a confrontation with the British until the United States Navy defeated the British forces on Lake Champlain. And then because the British forces on Lake Champlain were defeated, then Macomb, he took a lot of credit for saving Plattsburgh, and Congress gave him a big gold medal and made him hero. And later on, Macomb, during the administration of John Quincy Adams, when Jacob Brown was retired as the Commander General of the Armed Forces, John Quincy Adams had to make a decision. Do I go with General Scott or do I go with General Gaines? Both had their supporters, so he didn't go with either one. He went with Macomb instead.
Okay, Macomb
Macomb
shows up a lot.
Macomb shows up.
Yeah.
And they sent Macomb to Florida
to settle the Seminole War.
The end of the Seminole War. So it comes down to, what Gary's Ferry. He hoped to find some Indians there, but there were no Indians there. They said, you got to go down to Fort King, which is Ocala today. So he went, took his people, but he had his uniforms and all that stuff that he brought with him, a brass band and all this kind of stuff. Went all the way down the demarcation road to Ocala, Fort King, which was a pretty decrepit place. And they waited for some Indians to come in, and finally some Indians came in to get supplies because they had two policies of the federal government at that time. They were feeding the Indians to get them to come into the fort so they could seize the Indians and send them west. But the Indians would come in and get their supplies, and they wouldn't go west, they would go home. This was going on. So finally some Indians came in to get their supplies, and General Macomb decides he's going to have a meeting with the Indians and come up to an agreement. Well, they didn't know how to settle this thing, and someone finally said, okay, why don't we just give them some land, and they can have that land and be on their land, and they can live there forever, and we can get peace. So they got a big map of Florida, and they found out there was this creek, big river that came down through from central Florida down into Charlotte Harbor, and at that time it was called Pea Creek, P-E-A, Pea Creek. I don't know why they called it Pea Creek.
Peas grew there, obviously.
Pea Creek. Peas, I guess, grew there or something. So it's called Pea Creek. But then but Macomb says we got to have a better name for it. You know, we've got to put them over there. We've got to have a better name for the creek. So they get the Indians to come in. They get a big tent set up outside the fort. They're going to have this big high-powered conference there. And finally what they do is they get the Indians around the council fire, and finally Macomb comes out in his full uniform with his nice big shiny boots and white trousers and gold medal from Plattsburgh hanging around his neck. And he goes out and he talks to the Indians. He says, well, he didn't speak Seminole. He needed an interpreter. So they found a black slave who had been formerly a slave of the Seminoles, but had been seized from the Seminoles, so he knew some Seminoles. So they brought out the slave. And the slave was supposed to interpret. So they got the Indians seated. Macomb comes out, gives a big speech, ornate, florid speech. The black slave, he is interpreting. And finally the chief who was there says, he got it pretty much right, because the chief understood English all of the time.
They spoke English anyway.
They spoke English anyway. So they finally cut the deal, but Macomb changes the name Pea Creek to the Peace River. And they name it the Peace River because there's this agreement. If the Seminoles go along with the agreement, they can live on the east and the south side of Peace River for forever and forever and forever. And the white people coming down from the north can live on the northern, western side of the Peace River. And it would be called the Peace River, would be an eternal testament to eternal peace between these two nations. Well, peace lasted 5 years before the Third Seminole War, but that's another whole issue. But at any rate, I got involved with Macomb. Macomb shows up here. Macomb shows up here.
I never heard of Macomb, but apparently he was a big deal back then.
He was a big deal. He was a commanding general of the United States Army. He designed his own uniforms. He He lived well.
Probably had a big saber.
Yep, he had a big old sword. He had an ornate sword, actually, a very ornate sword. He had a big medal that he wore. His medal is Plattsburgh medal. And again, what happened down there is that they set up this eternal peace treaty along the Peace River. We still call it the Peace River. Most of the people who live there now, the name doesn't mean much because it's...
Is it still segregated? Indians on one side?
No. After the Third Seminole War came along, about 5 years later, a fellow named Billy Bowlegs was a chief of the Seminole, lived down sort of where Immokalee would be now. And he had a prize banana patch. So they wanted to get Billy Bowlegs stirred up to start another war. So they sent down a lieutenant to survey the area, and they came down and they hacked up Billy Bowlegs' banana patch, and Billy Bowlegs got upset.
He went bananas.
And he went bananas, and he attacked the people that messed up his banana patch, and that started the Third Seminole War, which was sort of a guerrilla conflict which lasted for a number of years. And finally, the Seminole were driven back into the Everglades, and that's where they still are today.
Even today. You know, I just got this notice. We're out of here.
Oh, we're out of here.
Throwing us out. I want to give you 1 minute uninterrupted, and then we'll close up.
Okay.
And I appreciate you showing up.
Yeah. I enjoy coming here, chatting with Reed. We see each other around town on occasion. At this point, as I said, I'm involved with the Florida Writers Association. I'm working on a couple of more books at the present time. And I also serve on the faculty of the Florida Writers Association Annual Conference, which is coming up in actually October. And it was interesting. Last October, I was down there. I was a presenter at the annual conference. And then I was talking with I was coming down the hall, and this one lady comes running up to me, and she says, "Hi, don't you remember me?" And I looked at her. I didn't remember her. And come to find out, her name was DoughHouck. She was in my class.
The train's leaving.
Yeah, the train is leaving.
Thank you.
I meet people as we travel around.
DoughHouck, do you have a phone number if they wanted to get in touch with you about any of this?
Yeah, 326-7664.
326-7664 if you wanted to talk to Doug. Thank you, everybody. Sorry, last caller. We haven't got much time left, so we're going to just have to go on. I want to thank the really special people who make this show possible: Chuck Kelsey, Devin Taylor, Chris Burt, Randy Burt, Chris Ramaker, Jeff Zook, Don Zenz, and John Hamels. It's a beautiful day out there. Don't forget the Arts and Crafts Show today, the 28th of September, and have a terrific time. What is that? July, right. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. May all that is proud and true and noble abide with you. I'm Reed Powers on July 28th.